All right, welcome to Science Sunday. Thanks for coming in. We've got a nice crowd here, and
I'm not sure they're nice. I haven't talked to all of them yet.
I have, and they are nice. They are
Okay.
nice. It sounds like you're in a pretty boisterous mood here.
Yeah, I'm in a good mood today.
You just celebrated your birthday a couple days ago, I know, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I did. It was a nice quiet celebration, but that was nice.
It's how they go nowadays.
Yeah, my husband and I have birthdays just a couple days apart, so we make a whole week out of it. And this year we decided to do birthday month.
Wow.
So I'm still in a good mood because I'm celebrating.
This could rapidly expand into something
Yeah.
crazy, like a birthday year or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Maybe when I turn 60, we'll do that.
Wow, all right. Well, we brought a fella that spent a lot of time on the railroad tracks to have some input on things. I want to make sure that we express that no one here is an expert, and you shouldn't take the points that we make or the statements that we make as statements coming from experts. We've looked into this topic. It has interest to us. Dan has a professional interest to it, but Dan Bailey is over here ready to come in and talk when we start moving on it as well too. I also asked Roy Gelder, who has a lot of current experience or not too long ago experience on railroads, and he was unable to make it. Another person I asked to come in and talk was Carl Nash from our community, who has been years in air quality in the EPA, and he had other concerns or other things he had to do as well today too, but he appreciated that we were talking about the topic. Again, if we make statements that aren't exactly true or accurate, we're doing our best with our layperson knowledge of the industry and of the science behind air quality too.
Well, and if somebody knows of additional information or corrections, that's one of the great things about streaming this on YouTube. You know, if you leave a comment on the video, you'll help clarify points for others. You can also ask a question in real time. And one of the things we really appreciate, if you're watching and you like what we're saying, please give us a thumbs up. I wanted to talk a little bit about why that's important just for a second.
Sure.
YouTube ranks videos based upon the content. And if you're looking at videos of trains or of the James Webb Telescope or anything that you might be interested in with science, you're not likely to find one of our videos because we don't get many thumbs ups. So getting a thumbs up on any of these topics really helps us by increasing the probability that other people will see these because it changes the algorithm that YouTube uses. So if you do view this online, those of you at home, I know we usually get 50 or 60 people that watch this online from home. If you like what we say, give us a thumbs up. If you don't, give us a thumbs down. Either way, if you can leave a comment or a thoughtful piece of feedback, it'll really help us reach more people over time. And if you think we're doing a good job here, help others discover it as well.
Right. I would say that, and I think I've said it a few times before too, if you're looking for deep science content, we hopefully scratch that surface, but there's a lot of videos out there by, Dawkins or a whole variety, Brian Greene in the physics department, a lot of different areas that can really deeply go into topics. We hope that we pique your interest. We hope that we talk about it in a layman's type of way that's of value to you as an intelligent layperson looking into the topics of science. And so that's our emphasis, and we hope that
And a
piques your
nice
interest.
person, our audience is apparent.
And they're nice people too.
That's right.
Yeah. So there is. It was an interesting topic for me to look into. I have spent a lot of time looking at a bunch of videos about what went on in East Palestine, and maybe you have too. There's been questions about even how much media attention went into it, and maybe that it was kind of brushed aside or said everything's being taken care of, and it started getting fairly political fairly quickly. I don't want to get political about this at all.
Okay.
We'll try to stay away from that as much as we can. But it is an interesting science topic, why trains do what they do, how they get the power to do what they do, what goes on in that, and what keeps our train system safe. And so all of those are interesting topics that I learned a lot about by looking into it. On February 3rd, just over a month ago, a freight train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. It was a 150-car train. It was operated by Norfolk Southern. It was carrying 20 cars of highly flammable toxic chemicals and a whole variety of other items too. It ignited a fire that's, you can see on some videos, that is almost a half a mile long, and it burned for days. And just why, some of the questions that I'd seemed to not hear about or not see as I was looking at some of these videos was, what makes a fire that's a half a mile long burn right alongside a railroad track? What is it? Is it the contents of this thing that are burning, and what's going on with some of that? And what did they do about that? It was 3 days later, on February 6th, officials with the Ohio National Guard and the U.S. Department of Defense, worried about the tankers that hadn't already combusted, instituted what they called a vent and burn operation. And it was a controlled ignition, if there is such a thing as a controlled ignition. And they claimed it
They're
would
called
allow the
rockets.
chemicals to safely dissipate.
Rockets,
Yeah,
controlled ignition.
yeah, you're right, yeah. So, about 1,500 people had already been evacuated after the derailment, and hundreds more followed suit just before a fireball erupted, sending a black plume of smoke over the region. And that was the thing that you saw on a lot of the videos, and that was, you know, the amazing thing that captured people's attention and was always on all the news things. And evacuees returned home a few days later, and they were told that all testing that was done showed that there was not much residue in the area, but they started complaining about burning eyes and different things that were going on, a burning sensation in their throat, and layers of soot all over, and also the creeks filled with dead fish. And some of the politics of that went on, where people said, you know, something like 45,000 dead animals are there, and other people were saying, well, many of them are minnows or something, you know. So it gets to the politics of, you know, what's a life in a how many animals are dead, and why they called it what they did.
Should you, count each one or measure it by weight?
Right, yeah. So, and so anyways, a lot of that was going on, and I wanted to talk about some of the issues that came up to me were somewhat of interest. This train was operated by Norfolk Southern, and it was about almost 9 p.m. on February 3rd, so pretty late in the evening. And it was only about 50 miles, actually, from its stop, which was Conway, Pennsylvania. East Palestine is like, half a mile from the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And the train pulled ahead after the derailment. The locomotives in the front part of the train pulled ahead and stopped only about 1,000 yards from actually going into Pennsylvania.
Does that mean there's a West Palestine in Pennsylvania?
I don't know.
I'm going to look that up.
Yeah. So anyways, the things that were going on with that were interesting to me is, why did this train derail right in this small town? What was going on with that? And I started looking into some of the incidences of what was going on with that. And maybe you've heard some of this. There's talk about, it was the 23rd car that happened to be a tanker car and had a wheel bearing failure. And I hadn't heard this at all before, and this is where a lot of what Dan's experience may help us out in some regards in this way. But they have what they call our hot box detectors. I'll show you a couple pictures here. This is a bearing of a train bearing. So these are called roller bearings. They're tipped at a certain angle so that they have constant pressure and force on the axle of the wheel. And these things can be replaced and repaired up to 5 times. I saw a video that showed exactly the whole procedure they go to replace and repair these bearings. They can do it right out on a train track. and when they need to, but typically they go through some overhaul when they're pulled off the train. The odd thing that maybe captures a lot of the problems is that one company owns the tracks that the train rides on. Another company operates the trains, Norfolk Southern. And Norfolk Southern, I think, only has maybe some locomotives that they own and a few maintenance cars and a few things like that. They don't own a lot of the train cars. A third company can own the train cars that get pulled, the tanker cars, and then even a fourth company can be responsible for the maintenance on them. They've taken out a contract with these things. So who's responsible starts getting kind of sticky pretty fast. Dan, did you have some thoughts you wanted to say?
On this,
Come up to the microphone.
yeah, on this stuff, what you're saying is, I last worked in 2004. So in those days, the train company would own the rails, they would own the locomotives, they would own a good percentage of the train cars. And like shippers would have cars that they owned, and other railroads. So the Norfolk and Southern would be pulling train cars that belong to the Burlington Northern, to the Union Pacific, to all these different, and little bitty railroads. There would be a lot of different train cars on some of these trains. But so those things are different right there. And the responsibility, they've been trying, the railroads are unionized, and so it seems like if they're having other companies perform functions like maintenance of way, then they can hire somebody that works for less, and maybe or maybe not be as qualified as their own employees that have been trained to do that kind of work and have to
Follow standards? Or
they follow more standards. I'm not sure that they don't have those standards, but my suspicion, being a union guy, is that, and having argued with management over safety and health issues, is that a lot of the decisions are made in order to reduce costs, and employees' costs are one of the biggest costs. So that would be something I'd be kind of suspect about, is like, are they getting the same kind of value? And then I've talked to, or I've seen some things about railway maintenance people saying that they have to do more track, take care of more track with fewer workers. They have some better tools, equipment now than they used to, but that's still, the railroads seem to be trying to do more with less. When we were there, a big train would be 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles would be humongous. 2 miles, no, that I didn't hear about 2 mile long trains. When I started, it was like 1/2 mile to 3/4 mile, and those would be easier to control.
Was this a 2 mile train that
That's a 2 mile
derailed?
long train.
Right.
And so, smaller train, smaller forces, and I think my idea would be, and I'm not an expert either, and my knowledge comes from 20 years ago, but my idea would be a smaller train would be easier to control and therefore less likely to have problems, for a couple reasons. One, when I started, they had cabooses, and there would be 2 people in the caboose and at least 2 people in the engine, the engineer and a trainman, and they would be looking back when you go around a curve to detect hot boxes. They would look for sparks. They would see something, if there was something going on wrong with the train. That's what they were there for. But they got rid of the caboose. They got rid of the conductor's now sitting on the head end of the engine. So instead of 4 or 5 people on the train, there are 2 people, and the train companies are trying to reduce it to 1 or none. So having a shorter train with a caboose and people watching the train, especially for some kind of safety, here I'm giving you what I think might help.
Well, let's get to that later.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of the incidents in there, but thank you. And you were an engineer on the trains,
I
right?
was an engineer, yeah.
Okay. This is the hot box detector. A hot box is kind of the terminology that's given for the bearings that are on each side of the wheel set of the train. And if they gain too much heat, if there is problems with the bearings as they spin and try to make the axle run freely, as they just go through their general wear and tear of years and years of working in a dusty, sooty environment, then the bearings can deteriorate, and as they deteriorate, they can start having more and more friction, which can build up to more and more heat. And so, and I brought in a bearing here, which is smaller than the bearings that go on the trains, but this is one that we use in a 7.5 horsepower spindle at work. And I had Scott work with it a little bit, and it runs pretty smoothly. You can see how this lets the inner part of the spindle spin around at high speeds, and this contains it inside a larger housing. So as these things get dust and dirt and contamination, rain and different things on it, then they start losing their effectiveness, and they can check for heat while the train's running with these hot box detectors. These are two different styles of hot box detectors. This one we took out of the machine. It doesn't feel too bad when you spin it, but it was not good enough for us. It caused vibration and so on that made our parts not as smooth finished as we'd like. So I'll hand this around and let you spin it around. There could be, it's pretty well cleaned off, but you may get a little bit of dirt on it. If you spin it, it'll feel pretty smooth, but not as smooth as we want. That would be suitable for the trains, I'd say, but you know, it starts to deteriorate. Obviously, when things deteriorate, there's more friction, and that causes heat, and heat is a terrible thing in terms of running smoothly. There's growth, there's expansion, which continues to grow and cause the problem to accumulate. And finally, what will happen is the bearings will get so hot that all the grease that's generally in there will boil out, right? So there's no grease, there's no lubrication, and then things can deteriorate pretty quickly. So these are actually thermal sensors that they can check each wheel set on a train. As a train goes along the track, goes along there, it checks each one, and it correlates, it counts the number of the car or the train, and it tests for heat. And it can identify heat and put it through a computer control system. And once it gets past a certain level of heat, then it'll notify the engineer in the front of the train who will have to take corrective action, which is basically stopping the train, okay? So these things are pretty handy devices because they check what's happening while you're actually running down the track. So very valuable types of devices to have. The question is, they aren't perfect because they're checking heat. What you really want to look for in a bearing is not heat as much as vibration.
If it gets to the point of making heat, it's already failing, right?
Right. I mean, what they can evaluate, they check these things and they saw, for example, I wrote it down. I think I said it was a 23rd car that the wheel bearing failure was in. At a milepost 79.9, there was one of these hot box detectors located, and it determined that the 23rd car wheel, and they have all this kept as good data, was 38 degrees above the ambient temperature. Well, the ambient temperature on a February night, 9 p.m., was 10 degrees that night. So this bearing was running along, and it run all the way from Conway, Illinois, which is near East St. Louis, all the way to the point that it had been at this point, and without getting more than 38 degrees above 10 degrees. Was it 48 degrees?
Centigrade? Or?
Fahrenheit.
Oh, okay.
So it was running pretty cool, running pretty fine. 10 miles later, at mile point 69.01, it was at 103 degrees above ambient temperature.
Wow.
So there was some growth, but still 103 degrees. When we run our spindles at work, where I work with precision machining, we call them pleasingly warm. They're warm. The spindles have to warm up, and so it's warm, but it's not anything serious. In fact, Norfolk Southern has a temperature of 170, I believe, 165, 170 is the temperature that an emergency signal goes out.
Yeah, but if it had been running for 200 miles at 38 degrees, and then within a couple of miles it spiked up to over 100 degrees, I mean, I do data analysis for a living, and it sounds to me like that's an indicator that you got a really rapid change, and that by itself is problematic.
And there can be different determinations of what you should do, when things should kick in. This is not federally mandated, so Norfolk Southern can set their own standards of when they want to do it. They obviously, like Dan is saying, they're trying to make money running a railroad, so they don't want to replace bearings that are going to be fine, right? I don't know what the other normal temperatures are or what goes on from that, but it's known as pretty standard temperature. But it is a pretty interesting spike. Finally, just before East Palestine, there was another hot box, and it gave a reading of 253 degrees above ambient temperature. So in another 35, 40 miles, the thing jumped from 103 to 253 degrees. At Fahrenheit 212 is when water is boiling, and grease is often water-based, so this had boiled off and it was in terrible shape. Actually, there's also a closed-circuit camera TV you might have seen in a town called Salem, Ohio, which is maybe 15 miles, 20 miles further west prior to up track, let's say, from where East Palestine is. And that was just a closed-circuit camera with people checking the security of their parking lot that happened to be by the railroad track. And it showed the train going by, and you see sparks flaring and jumping out of it. And this is 20 miles before they got to East Palestine, too. So there was some bad things happening to the bearing. There's no question that the bearing was a problem. It's pretty well determined that the operators of the crew of the train operated properly, acted properly. They initiated a braking of the train. And the part I don't really understand, and I've been frantically trying to figure it out before this, and I'm going to continue to look into it, but for the things I read seem to say that as they did this, they were notified by an automatic system that the hot box detector sends an immediate alarm to the engineers at the front of the train. They then initiated a braking motion, which somehow, and maybe Dan has some clarity on this too, but we talked about it a little bit and we weren't sure why, but somehow it also seemed to initiate an emergency braking action too, which that seemed to be the thing that, I don't know if are they reversing the spin of the wheels? That's kind of maybe an old cartoon thing, I think, or something like that. But I don't know how they brake a train, really, and maybe you can talk a bit about that.
Okay.
Make sure you come up to the microphone.
Okay, so, now I can see. I wasn't talking into the microphone before. Excuse me. But, yeah, the braking system that I work with, and now they have more advanced, that are electrically operated brakes that can be used, but I don't think they are in wide use. But the braking system I used, and I think was in effect on this train, but not absolutely sure, is an automatic braking system. So if you take air out of this, there's a pipe that runs all the way, the pipe that runs through every car, and they hook up the air through flexible connectors between each car. And so you charge up the brake system, and that through some ingenious devices puts a reservoir of air in each car. So after it's all charged up, once you reduce the level of air pressure in the train brakes, that pipe, then the braking system will detect the change and apply brakes to the wheel using the reservoir of air that's in each car. And that's an automatic brake system. What happens is if there's a problem with the brake system, and let's say there becomes one of the couplers between the cars comes uncoupled, all of a sudden it drops to 0 right there, and then that initiates an emergency brake application from wherever the hole or the break in the air pressure system is. And that can sometimes, when I was there, and that was 20 years ago, when I was there were some cars that sometimes were not perfectly maintained, and so the mechanism might be a little hair-triggered, and it would go into an automatic emergency when you just wanted to do a regular, gradual stop. And so that could be, if it actually did go into an emergency brake system, it might have been from something unintended.
Some other car or something.
Yeah, some other car that just wasn't, the brakes weren't adjusted properly. There's other things. Sometimes the couplers get stretched too much or compressed too much, and then that opens up more of an aperture or a gap, and then that can make it go into an emergency air brake application.
Can one car stop 2 cars worth of payload? The brakes on one car. So what if the brakes fail on a train car? I'm just wondering what if one of the train cars applied its emergency braking mechanism. Is that sufficient to cause an emergency stop for the whole train, or is it just?
Well, what happens is, yes. Short answer, yes, and let me make it a little bit longer. What happens is when the one car goes into emergency air brake application, then it automatically empties all the air out of its pipe, and then
all downstream.
Then it goes downstream. It's just like it transmits it really quickly throughout the train, starting from a place where the engineer would not have wanted it to start, but it starts from there, and it just makes
Cascades, yeah.
It cascades all the way down, so the whole train eventually goes into, actually pretty quickly goes into a rapid emergency
How long does
brake
it take
application.
a train to stop? Is one of you are going to talk about that, I assume, after the brakes are applied?
Well, let's see. It can take a mile to stop a train, or something like that. I mean, depends on how heavy the train is, what's going on.
But not 10 miles.
No. It's more. You could stop the train in half a mile. It depends. Somewhere. I don't really remember how long it took, because I haven't been doing it for a while. And but it was somewhere in the range of half a mile to a mile on a train going like 50 or so miles an hour, 60 miles an hour would take to stop. And this is not precise at all. Yeah. So,
but it's on the order of a mile, not on the order of 10 miles.
Yeah, it's not going to be 10 miles. And if you and they have the dynamic braking, which is an electric brake on the engines, and that can be pretty powerful, and that can make the train stop faster.
It's electromagnetic braking, right?
Yeah, it's electromagnetic braking. And the train. The train generator or alternator, the wheels is an electric motor and on all the wheels. So what happens is a locomotive generates a lot of electricity that goes to the wheels. The wheels, or the traction motors they call them, that are on the wheels, and those traction motors, those are what power the train. Actually power the train. So. And what they do with this braking system is they reverse the polarity on the generator or on the motor and turn it into the opposite. So the momentum, the
counteracts the momentum.
It counteracts the momentum. It turns the momentum into electrical energy, and then into heat energy, which. I just thought that was amazing, because I stopped a train of 100 and 100 cars of some kind of ore. And so it's probably about 10,000 tons with three, they're big locomotives, but just with the, just with the dynamic brake. So it's pretty powerful. And I guess I'm a little geeky about this. Anyway.
All right, cool.
But,
All right, thanks.
yeah.
So, yeah, this was some of the action that went on, and for some reason, at the point they decided to stop the train, they made a conscious effort, they were instructed and they followed the rules to stop the train. That cascaded into an emergency stop, which then resulted in the train derailing. So I think we have to let the NTSB go further than this. I'm not trying to speculate about anything more than that. I'm trying to just tell the facts of what we know. I don't know why it did what it did. I do have a couple of questions and thoughts about it, but you know, there are better ways than these hot box detectors to check the vibration levels inside train cars, but those travel with each bearing set. So that's a lot of money that the train companies don't really want to put out, although it would be more accurate. But you know, we've gone quite a long time without train disasters as well. There's fairly often derailments, but they're minor derailments in nature. This was a pretty outside-the-box catastrophic problem that doesn't normally happen, obviously.
Are there different monitoring frameworks or paradigms based upon the contents of a given train, I wonder?
I think that I have not heard that there are, and there are some issues, I think, that, you know, when I get to a point of a couple of thoughts about it, that one tends to go along with that. Why have these long trains, especially if there's some hazardous waste being carried in some of them? And part of it is money savings, that if you can have a train and you can pull along 150 cars rather than 80 cars, and you have two, in this case there were three, there was an engineer and I believe a conductor and a conductor in training on this ride at this point. But you have only three people doing that. If you're going to take the 20 cars, 20 of these cars were hazardous, carrying hazardous materials, and if you're going to make a special train that carries just that, it messes with your scheduling and your planning, and whatever happens at a factory. A factory has, you know, 20 tank loads or 5 tank loads, let's say, of a certain chemical, and they need it to get to another place. They've got contracts to fulfill and so on too. I'm trying to always get my stuff that we make at Sedwell Manufacturing out to customers all over the country and overseas, Malaysia and things like that. You don't want to hear that they're not going to come pick up your load,
Right.
you know, your material that you have. So there's a lot of pressures for them to perform. This, I'm not sure how well it can be seen, but this is somewhat of the ideas about what went on after the spill. You can see in the middle there's a bunch of tumbled tank cars represented there, and a fire starting in one, and so that was a derailment. On the top of it, it does show that states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and the path that the train took from near East St. Louis out through Illinois and all the way over to, it was only about 50 miles away from its stopping point when it derailed.
Could we zoom in on that slide a little bit? It's a little easier to read if we zoom in. There we go.
And the middle one shows there's a gray bunch of boxes there and a few yellow and red ones. That's showing the number of trains on the line, 150, give or take a few. The yellow ones, I believe, are the trains that derailed, and the red ones are hazardous waste trains that derailed. About 11 hazardous tank cars derailed.
Trains that derailed or cars that derailed?
Cars, excuse me.
Yeah.
Train cars that derailed. All right. Which caused a pretty immense fire. And I was kind of wondering, why is there a fire when this happens? trying to look into it and understand it, and this is one theory, and I'm not sure what it is, but Steve Sekeli, the chief of the Mahoning County Hazmat, told radio station there, when our first responders arrived at the scene, we didn't know what chemicals were there, but you can smell it in the air that there was something. So Governor DeWine of Ohio said that the state had not been alerted that what was considered a high hazardous material train was traveling through Ohio, and I'm sure that there's certain levels that make you have to make certain announcement that this is a highly dangerous capacity train. You know, certain things I know going through tunnels, trains can't go through tunnels with certain loads and so on too. But mainly what was on the train was the vinyl chloride. And vinyl chloride is used to make poly PVC pipes, polyvinyl chloride pipes, which many of us have in our homes, you know, as a solid state. This is a gas that's usually transported as a liquid in these tank cars. The tank cars are built with an inner chamber and then the outer chamber, which is what we see. In between that, there's usually nitrogen, a fairly inert gas that's kept in between the two to try to stop any leaks from getting out into the atmosphere. Again, they aren't owned by Norfolk Southern. They're owned by a third party who maybe rents them out to a fourth party and has them taken care of by a fifth party. But anyways, the vinyl chloride has the potential, and this, if you're at home, you can maybe get even closer and spread it out and see the vinyl chloride travels as a monomer, and it's on the bottom left there, and it's got basically chlorine and hydrogen and carbon in it. And it can polymerize under heat or a change in pressure, and polymerizing can be fairly dangerous. That's as far as I want to get into the chemical knowledge of it. I don't want to go too far. But so one thing that I saw, and I'm still wondering what makes this all burn, and why is there a half-a-mile length of fiery train cars, you know? And this is one person's that sounds pretty knowledgeable to me, and it hasn't been talked about, so I thought I wanted to share it. Again, I'm not an expert and can't vouch for it exactly, but I want to say that this made a lot of sense to me when other things weren't making it that much sense. The first responders, this person says, are what made a bad accident in Ohio so bad. They called CSX, which is the company that owns the rail lines. So they knew that CSX was responsible for these rail lines to find out what the train was carrying, and CSX couldn't tell them because it wasn't their train. It's a Norfolk Southern train. They also didn't call the National Hazmat Emergency Hotline because they didn't know to do that. So they went in and tried to extinguish the fire with water. Hot vinyl chloride, when exposed to water, creates phosgene gas, the chemical weapon of choice during World War I, and absolutely lethal. It was used in the trench warfare in World War I. It's not the main product. It's a minimal outflow of phosgene. It usually makes hydrochloric acid and carbon dioxide.
Just acid and,
Right.
Yeah, right.
But it, you know, and hydrochloric acid is at different, strengths and so on too.
Yeah.
But, so that's a little bit, you know, it does make phosgene gas, but it's not the main output of it. The phosgene, you can't use water on hot vinyl chloride until you shut off the supply of it. They realized something was wrong and retreated from the site. The hazmat experts couldn't immediately enter. So once this is going, now they've got a real conflagration and gas, and they were overcome by things, and they weren't prepared for this, so they backed off, right? This was, again, Friday. It was February 3rd at about 9 p.m., and they're out there almost immediately trying to solve this.
Well, it's probably a small-town volunteer fire department too, right?
That happens to be right by railroad tracks.
Yeah.
You would expect people to know what to do about this, or, you know, to some extent, right? But, so the hazmats couldn't immediately enter the site once they arrived because of the phosgene. The delay meant the fire had increased the internal pressure of the tank cars to terminal levels and they were going to explode. There's a question, what they decided to do was to vent and burn these things, which they actually tossed an incendiary device into one of them and caused it to blow up. And that's the big explosion that happened, not until the 6th,
They did
February
that
6th.
deliberately?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes that's a reasonable thing to do. You know,
Right,
get
it's
a-
a, it's a
get ahead of it.
topic, I mean, and that gets to a lot of questions too, that end up being political as well.
Sure.
You get this fire done and over with, and the track's cleared, and then you get the next train can get through, right? And that's maybe not the best thing either, but. And again, I want to caution that this, you know, the NTSB and a lot of other people more knowledgeable than me will come up with better answers than this, but this is something that I thought was valuable to talk about. So that's what led to the expanded evacuation order a few days later. They said that they were going to explode. They were measuring the heat and the pressure inside these tanks, and they know what temperature and pressure they were, you know, the chemistry of it is that they'll explode at.
Yeah, and the tank cars can only withstand so much internal pressure.
Right. So this man said, I'm on the other side of an adjacent state, and the mass casualty crews in his area were all called up in anticipation of the explosion. It would send shrapnel, right, parts of the train cars through the town. It could have been, you know, very catastrophic, very, very dangerous. So the hazmat team decided to rupture one car with the highest pressure using a small demolition explosive and an incendiary device to ignite the escaping vinyl chloride. The other cars had their safety valves broken by the intense heat, and those cars were pierced with conventional tools, and the vinyl chloride was ignited. I heard that they prepared some trenches and maybe had some mats and things underneath it so that it wouldn't seep into the ground, and then got much of it into the trench, and then had incendiary devices ready inside the trench, so when it poured into there, then it could explode in there. The vinyl chloride was burned as it left the cars to prevent it from entering the groundwater. Burning it obviously isn't ideal, but it's infinitely better than letting it leach into the soil, and it absolutely had to be let out of the tank, so the explosion would have destroyed a big part of the town. This man's opinion, it was the best option among bad options. The accident itself should never, ever have happened. There's no excuse for it. The railroad doesn't own most of the cars on the rails, mostly coal hoppers and maintenance cars as well as the locomotives. The cars are owned by third parties, like I was saying earlier, and maintained by still another party. Then there's questions, you know, what caused it or something else, but there's time to look into that and see what's going on. It's not a mini Chernobyl in this person's opinion or anything. There was a release of some amounts of gases that are not harmful or not helpful to people's lives. They are taking tests. The Norfolk Southern came in with their analysis devices. The EPA has been in there with their devices checking, and most of the results seem to say that there is not a measurable even amount of chemicals
Caustic and harmful.
into people's homes and into the air around there, which makes some people say, see, aha, cover-up, I knew it. And, you know, it's hard to say. There's people that still have irritations in their eyes and their throats. There's people, you know, that won't go back to their homes yet and being careful about it, and who knows what outcomes can be in 10 or 15 years down the road. They're obviously very scared, concerned. You know, it's not a pleasant circumstance to have your town be assaulted in this way.
Do you mind rewinding the narrative a bit? You talked about the emergency braking activated. So it was right after that braking event that the derailment happened? The train did not have an opportunity to come to a controlled stop then? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. They stopped the train and they went back and saw that there was a derailment. I'm not sure that they knew that there was a derailment. Maybe you'd imagine by the way that thing, maybe it's separated in some ways and cars behind derailed and they didn't notice it as much. They came to a stop. They actually de-hooked and pulled the locomotives another 1,000 yards down the road, which almost brought them into another state, right? It was so close to the Pennsylvania border.
Would that mean that there was probably a failure?
Hang on just a second for the microphone here.
I was going to say, does that mean that there was probably a failure in the track?
I don't, again, the National and TSB will go through all that and be very careful about doing it, and I don't want to speculate too much. I think that the incidences of the braking caused the problems.
But the system, they should be able to do an emergency brake without derailing the train.
That's the problem, and that's what Dan and I spend a lot of time talking about, and it doesn't, why would you make an emergency braking system automatically actuate that causes the train to derail?
Yeah.
And I don't understand, and I think that part of it is that there's physics in all this, and the physics of that train with the load it has and everything that's going on to it is specific to that train, and the physics of their decision-making is, you know, more general to what you should do when a train is in trouble in that way. There's changes. This has been something that wasn't around when Dan was first around. They call it power distribution, I believe, where there's a train, there's actually a locomotive 2/3 of the way back in there that is also providing power, somehow coupled up with the front trains in coordination. They were just experimenting with that when you were around. And so that is supposed to give much better control of stopping conditions, how you stop it. The more, I mean, the basic physics that you can say is the more mass you have moving along at a speed, and it was going 47 miles an hour, which is below the 50-mile-an-hour rate for it to go through East Palestine. It was not malfunction. It was not breaking any speed rules or anything like that. But the weight of that train, the mass and momentum of that train, has impact that then has to be stopped, and it's an incredible amount of momentum to stop.
Well, the way Dan described the braking, then each car has braking. It's like an all-wheels braking throughout the train. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's not just braking at the engine,
Right.
right?
You want to
Yeah.
come over here to this?
Let me clarify. There
You
is
can
a-
sit here if you want
Yeah,
to.
why don't you sit here?
Yeah, well, there is the automatic brake system for the whole train, which would even apply at the engine, but the engineer has control over the engine brakes, and he can take that off or apply it. That's independent, but the whole train goes into emergency when you do a brake system application, the whole train goes. It applies in the whole train. If it's a controlled one, if you start at the engine, it will very rapidly supply first to one of the first few cars to the engine, to the first car, the next car, the next car, the next car.
Incrementally down the line.
Yeah, incrementally down the line. That's the way it's supposed to work. Sometimes you have cars that are more sensitive, and they'll react. The fourth car might react before the second car.
It's hydraulic?
It's air. Yeah, air.
But it's not electronic.
No, the electronic ones would be.
You can be
That's what
normal.
they-
You don't have to be that close.
Okay, the electronic ones, I think I don't think they're in wide use now. Like they were talking about them, I guess, for the past 20 years. But if that was the case, then you could have had much more control.
It is a question in terms of just trying to understand. My puzzlement is, I think, what you're saying. How is it that you decide to stop a train, and then that causes it to derail? And I may be misleading. I don't want this to be taken in any other way, but that would be something that I would look to have explained to me, why that can be and what happens with that. A question behind?
Oh, hello?
Yes.
Is it on? Okay. You had mentioned earlier that the governor had said that they were not alerted that there were hazardous materials cars coming through the state of Ohio. As a tangent to that, I have a question about, are there different or additional protocols for hazardous waste cars, or different braking, or different types of cars or things like that when there are hazardous material cars coming through? You would think that a hazardous, like, I don't know, you said about 10 cars were hazardous materials?
I think 20 were, and 11 of them were derailed.
Okay, so if you have a 2-mile-long train with 20 cars that have hazardous materials, you might think to handle those cars separately or differently. And I'm wondering about the different protocols for those kinds of things, and if those were clearly not, listened to or whatever in regards to, I mean, they should be handled differently. Quite frankly, they should have maybe different braking systems, maybe double up on the braking systems, more employees watching for like we were talking earlier. Things just should be different for these cars versus a car of coal or something.
Yeah, and that may come out. I find it hard to imagine that you can't stop any one car faster than any of the other 130 on the train or something like that, too. So it's a whole moving unit that probably has to be treated as one. I would think, in my opinion, that the trains at the length that they're at, which is fairly new, that's coming along as a newer tactic now in a money savings type of effort, is putting some concerns in terms of how do you know that the train can do the things it has to do. I was wondering, I think that there probably will be recommendations, again, and I'd rather leave it to the NTSB to say what it should be, but it could be that trains that have, more than one or two hazardous materials on board, cars with hazardous materials maybe have to be a separate train or something like that. There are possibilities. That's at least something to look at, and but we're after the almighty dollar and so on too. So there's issues like that. The other question I had before Joanne asked her question is, I was wondering why you have a hot box detector right before a town. They saw 18 miles before this, or so, 20 miles before this, in Salem, Ohio. They saw in this video, in this closed circuit TV, they saw sparks and immense amount of flame underneath one of the tracks. I was wondering, and I talked to Dan about this, and I talked a little bit to Roy about this too, and Roy is being very careful about what he's saying. He's willing to wait 5 years to hear what the NTSB has to say, and that's understandable. I don't blame him for that. But I don't know why you have a hot box right before a town. What if it had been 5 miles before the town, and then they noticed how terrible things were, and then slowed the train down under normal braking systems, knowing what was going on? Or if they had the hot box, if everything went exactly the same, the train could have derailed, everything could have been exactly the same, but not right in front of a town. It seems like the hot box in front of East Palestine told the engineers to hit the brakes, which then helped incur this tragedy. So, I was asking Roy, you wouldn't put a hot box like 100 yards in front of a bridge that goes over a chasm out west or something like that, right? That, now you got to put the emergency brakes on right before you go over the bridge. You'd want to have it 2 or 3 miles before this bridge. So, maybe that's something that'll come out of it too. Again, I'm not an expert in any sense. I'm just trying to come up with a few thoughts about what I thought might be interesting about this or useful to consider. Any other points about that?
I think you're coming up with good questions. My question would be, I think somebody has already talked about it. With using all the information, what can we do to prevent something like this from happening again? And that would be it. And I hope that's what guides their report.
My wife kept asking me when I was talking with Jane about this, she kept saying, why did they let this thing go? Is that all you can do? What if you just let the vinyl chloride pour out somewhere? Or why did they burn all 5 of them? Only one of them was getting up to temperature. Why did they burn the other 4? You know, so there's a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts about it. And, you know, sometimes you hope, and, you know, I have to make fast decisions at work. When you were an engineer, you had to make fast decisions once in a while. And you have to make fast decisions at work about times and so on. But, you know, my guys working on parts have to make, you know, you have to make a decision and then live with what you think is the best. And hopefully you have some level of background and training and education so that the decision you make stands the test of time. Joanne?
Yeah, I was wondering about this bearing. We do know that, you know, when a bearing really seizes up, it just, everything stops.
Yeah.
So is it possible that essentially the front end of that car stopped, and so it was stopping before everything else was happening? And so all of a sudden you've got 2 miles of train smashing into one car that is in the process of stopping, while the rest of the train's going on very nicely. And this would not have interrupted the braking system at all. I mean, George Westinghouse did a great job building that, what, 150 years ago now?
Yeah.
And it's worked, which works well, as long as you maintain the air pressure.
No, and I would imagine the weight of all those cars behind it, the mass and momentum of all those going behind it, they're going to keep moving that car down the road. It's not going to stop. It's going to move slower maybe than the others, which can throw it off the track and start everything going off the track as well, too. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, and as far as burning vinyl chloride, it's a silly idea. When you burn ethylene chloride, which is what this is, you're really going to get 2 products. You're going to get carbon dioxide, 3 products: carbon dioxide, water, and chlorine dioxide, which is the fully oxygenated version. That is, when we talk about burning, it's oxidation. So when you oxidize,
When you talk about burning, it's what?
you're burning vinyl chloride.
Yeah.
So you're going to get carbon dioxide, you're going to get water, and you're going to get chlorine dioxide. It's very, very difficult under those conditions to get phosgene. Phosgene is a reduced product, and it burns. Phosgene itself burns, and it burns up to hypochlorous and then to chlorine dioxide. And these essentially are they're good acids, they're strong acids, and HClO is bleach, for instance. So we talk about chlorine bleach. This is the way you would produce it. So I'm skeptical about this idea that there's going to be a lot of phosgene around. I worked in a company that made phosgene. We did it for a living. It was dangerous. We had one person have 1 drop on their skin, and it killed them 4 hours later. It's really, really bad stuff. But it's easily oxidized. It doesn't stick around long.
Okay. That's good information. That's what I like about coming here. We get all this background from people that have specialties and knowledge in areas that I don't. Yeah, again, so much of going through this, I felt like I was winnowing through a whole lot of political diatribe, a lot of, you know, people being really, really scared, and some people being reasonable about being scared about it, concerned about it, worried about their and their children's health, and other people maybe playing the scaredness for what it got them in political points or things like that,
Yeah, and I don't
too.
mean to negate the idea that chlorine dioxide and hypochloric are meaningless little things. They're not. They're something that you should be careful of. But again, they're water soluble. And just like hydrochloric acid, there are different forms of hydrochloric acid. They go into the water. The pH goes like a rock. It goes down to 3 or 4. But it washes away fairly quickly. And a little bit of soda ash or something along that line, baking powder would neutralize it completely in no time at all.
Right, right. And hopefully, you know, there's people involved, the EPA, there's knowledgeable people, obviously, on the ground there doing things. It seems in many ways that good practices came in when things went on. The one question was, what do you do, and should more people along railroad tracks or whatever, emergency responders, know what to do in case that vinyl chloride is spilled or other hazardous things are spilled. They come out there with as many people as they can, they call the fire departments from every town nearby, and they're all pouring water on it as fast as they can, and maybe that, according to this person at least, and I know it'll get clarified, but you would hope that cities and towns along railroad lines would know how to handle this and have the proper equipment ready to handle things like that too. Do we have any comments, Scott, or?
No, I thought maybe there was one, but
Okay.
I was mistaken.
All right. Well, other than that, I know there's other stuff. The drinking water is supposedly not bad. It was a very low level of spilled chemicals. There were a lot of minnows and amphibians and fish died in it, and
They may have vulnerabilities that humans don't have too, so just, I'm not saying it's a good thing or something we could or should ignore whenever we have a deleterious impact on an ecosystem like that, but because a frog or a fish died does not mean that that's poisonous to humans.
right.
It could be, but we don't know yet.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of care and evaluation that has to go on. Again, they have not detected noticeable levels in all the tests, which again, make some people angry that they haven't, and other people, they say, you can smell it. My house smells terrible. I know what my house smells like. I've lived here for 20 years. It's not right.
Yeah.
So it's a tough thing trying to analyze and make that work.
Well, like
well for
Joanne said
people.
with vinyl chloride, if it's eager to grab oxygen, then if it goes into the water and it grabs some of the oxygen that's in the water, then things that live in the water could suffocate from that, right? If you get a big chemical dump into water. So there's many reasons that something could be dangerous. And I certainly don't intend to minimize it, but that's where science comes in. You say chemicals. A train was carrying chemicals. Well, a chemical could be water, right? Chemical could be something relatively inert, like coal. So I think that sometimes when dealing with these from a public relations standpoint, people start using vocabularies that are incendiary instead of being more careful and cautious, and I guess those mean the same
I
thing.
like to remind people that humans are chemicals.
Right, yeah, I apparently am made of chemicals,
So passenger trains carry chemicals.
right?
Yeah, and railroad tracks and,
Railroad tracks are made of chemicals. So here's a picture of the controlled release, which, is an interesting picture.
It's a lot of control right there.
It's a lot of stuff being controlled. So hopefully, and they have done controlled releases in other places, and hopefully the people there handled it, with as much capacity as they were able to, and they came in with good attacks at it. Maybe there's things to learn about it, things to adjust, and things to change about it. People try to go into a whole variety of different things, whether there should be trains that are 2 miles long, and that is a very good question, I think.
Well, the NTSB historically does a good job
Right.
of finding the root cause and making regulation changes. That happens in the airline industry frequently, that once they discover a root cause, if it's just, maybe it's a particular electronic component in the train that is a standard component, and they figure out that it's prone to more failure than it should be. Maybe they figure out it's the signaling system that you were talking about. Maybe it's the number of cars. There's any number of things that they'll consider. And generally, I think our NTSB in this country does a pretty good job of taking their job seriously and trying to correct systemic problems.
There is a big discussion in terms of how do you respond to this, and should there be more controls over the railroads and other ways of moving things around, tankers and so on? Should there be, should you let these people go with the different companies go with what they feel is best, because they should know how to run their business the best way possible. So it's a balance, and you hope that, yeah, the people take the NTSB's recommendations to heart. It may be that you need to have a little bit more regulation on things too, right? To say how many train cars can be put on a train total, how many carrying some kind of hazardous kind of chemical, and also how many people should be running the train, and they can have all sorts of things about, like I said, more complex means of actually evaluating the bearing conditions and so on too.
Well, all three of the people, I assume, were up in the lead engine.
That's all they ever are. There's no
Right.
cabooses, there's
So
no.
you could put 30 people up there, and it wouldn't have probably made a difference. I don't know. Again,
Right.
I don't see the results of the.
No, but if you have a shorter train, and Dan, you were telling me that your training was when you went around a curve, if you didn't look back and see around that curve to look specifically for sparks coming under the wheels, you weren't doing your job. You know, and then when you went another train on the other side, when you took a turn the other way, you were instructed that you had to look back, and people were supposed to look forward that were in back too. So now the trains there's no way you can see back for 2 miles and see the things that go on.
And there aren't people at the other end of the train.
And there aren't people at the end of the train anymore, right? So, hopefully this was interesting to you. I liked studying it. There's really some nice things on YouTube if you just do the East Palestine train derailment. If you talk about bearing replacement in trains, they show this fairly complex method of how they take these bearings and repair them and get them back so that they're back in good shape again. I'm
like-
sure that there's a few on this train that
Is
won't
it
be
like
repaired.
repairing a tire on the side of the road?
They can bring out a special lift vehicle that puts a platform between two rail cars and lifts up that train in that point. So they're called wheel sets that have 4 wheels, 2 sets of wheels make a trolley, I guess. And so they can lift that up, and they can actually, this whole thing is just on there by gravity. So that you can lift the train off the wheel set, come in with a repair wheel set, put in a whole new 2 wheels in there with a special kind of
It's called
long
a truck,
jacking
isn't
kind of
it?
thing.
The wheel,
I've
assembly of the
heard them
truck.
called that, yeah. Or, and so the whole thing is just sitting on a pin and rotating and moving on a pin like that, a big pin. So, they can do repairs at the field, and that's what I think they do. If they detect something like this, a bad bearing, they'll replace it. They'll stop the train and replace it right on site.
They may do that now. When I was there, we would take the car and carefully put it onto a siding, because there were sidings in more locations than there probably are now. And then they'd leave it there, and then
Repair it.
someone would come out and repair it enough to get it to a place where they could do major repairs if it needed that. But they do whatever needed to be done in the siding.
siding is a
A si-
spur that goes off.
Right, a siding is a track that goes off, connected by a
Emergency
switch.
turnaround,
It goes off onto another track that's near the main track, the mainline track.
And you can park a
You
few
can
cars
park,
there.
you can leave stuff in there, and then the main line would still be clear for you to have through freight trains or passenger trains come by without being slowed down by the car that you set off in the siding.
Okay.
It's interesting to me that, 150, 180 years after trains were developed, we're still using trains. Trains are still an integral part of our goods transportation in the world. You've seen a lot of horses and buggies and other kinds of transportation technology come and go, but locomotives, with their ability to haul just tremendous amounts of material over land.
Well, yeah, with the developments that have happened too, it's not the same technology it was back then. The diesel motors and all the power that's generated in that thing lets you pull a train that's 2 miles long. In the old days, the horses would race them and the horse might win, right? So, All right, well, thanks so much for coming to Science Sunday. I appreciated all the turnout here and very much enjoyed your presence here. Thanks so much.